Welcome to the Why We Fight podcast. I'm your host, Justin Stam. If you're looking for truth, political clarity, and a strong path forward to fight for the survival of Western civilization, then you're in the right place. If not, then catch up, get with the program, or go piss off. We're done with diplomacy. We're in the middle of a war, and you're either with us or against us. This is Why We Fight. If you want to contribute directly to my work, follow me on Twitter X and you can tip me with either cash or Bitcoin, or you can subscribe by going to my Subscribestar page at Why We Fight Podcast with Justin Stam. And you can choose 3 different tier levels to contribute to this important work. But whatever you decide to do, thank you for listening. I appreciate all of my listeners. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Ravenscrag. The name alone conjures up an ominous tone, and it's a subject that everyone in the fight for the survival of the West should be familiar with. But before I go into that, let me just say Happy New Year 2024. Today is Sunday, December 31st, and it's New Year's Eve 2023. It's been a whirlwind year of change, but I think 2024 is going to be absolutely chaotic. So as we sit on the cusp of the coming and inevitable turmoil to follow, I wanted to encourage as many people to begin thinking in terms of worldview politics and worldview philosophy that drives worldview politics, because essentially they're the same. And this is a basic understanding that any of the particular opinions and perspectives that you have on subjects in your life, including your political philosophy, does not stem from the individual, but it stems from a worldview, a total worldview, that one may possess when making decisions about anything whatsoever, really. Anything. And why this is so important to understand to protect yourself in the coming chaos is because you need to be made aware of the fact that those that are promoting deconstructionism and far-left ideologies that are opposed to you don't do anything as individual acts and the choice of individual circumstances, but they also act in accordance with their total worldview as well. So everything they do is very intentionally driven towards a definitive outcome. How they accomplish that is through a controlled demolition of your worldview, to cause you to lose your sense of self while keeping you satiated in the belief that you're participating with a fair and balanced democracy that gives you freedom, when in reality, you're a prisoner to their machinations. This illusion that they keep you bound up in is something I like to call Ravenscrag, a mental prison. And how is it a mental prison? Well, what is Ravenscrag? Before I explain what Ravenscrag is and its history and what role it played in the past within the intelligence community, let me read to you a perfect description of the nature of the intelligence communities, which is totally different than what you may think about them. And then you'll have an understanding of how they develop their policies in order to direct society towards that end. And that end is what we see manifested in our world today. Quote, "Our aim is to control an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation." Let me read that again. Our aim is to control an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation. 1952 declassified internal CIA memo from Operation MKUltra. Against laws of nature as self-preservation, willfully running towards extinction, suicide, and nihilism. Now, if you go to the Wikipedia description of MKUltra, they claim it was just an illegal program that they experimented with people in mental institutions unwittingly with LSD and other certain types of techniques for, mind control, mental programming. So even when they tell you the truth and admit they did something wrong, unethical, and even illegal, they can't even tell the truth about what they did. MK Ultra was a mind-altering program for the entire society, not just people that acted as lab rats in a mental hospital called Ravenscrag. Modernist society and the political structure is a mental prison you are entrapped by, and you don't even know it. You're a victim of mental terrorism and are entrapped by a false political participation of democracy that I like to call Ravenscrag. So, what was the real Ravenscrag in real life? Ravenscrag was the name of a mental hospital that was converted from a home that was built and owned by Sir Hugh Allen, a wealthy Canadian industrialist that donated his home for medical use, known as Allen's Memorial Hospital. Later came to be known as Ravenscrag. Now, Ravenscrag came into the possession of the Canadian government, and in the post-World War II years where the intelligence agencies of America and Canada cooperated together in different programs. One program in particular that they partnered with was the MK Ultra programs, where they did experiment on mental patients that were insane. But as we came to find out later on in declassified information, many of the people that were experimented on didn't just happen. It didn't just take place at Ravenscrag. It took place in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, at host sites. But also, it was much broader in application than just being isolated to one particular mental hospital in Canada. And it kind of reminds me of a conversation that took place between myself and our family friend Tonio, who I explained before was with Frank Sinatra for 14 years. And Frank Sinatra in about 1960 was approached by John F. Kennedy, who was going to become the president, who was in the election year, I think it was, or it was 61. But regardless, John F. Kennedy took a great interest in going out of his way to tell Frank that he thought that he should act in this movie. And this movie ended up being The Manchurian Candidate. And he felt real strong about this because he thought that if America was going to be different than the totalitarian governments of communist countries that they were supposedly against during the Cold War, that they had to make a stand in exposing what he had already witnessed as the president and as a politician that was aware of these issues, some of the operations that were being run by the CIA and the intelligentsia of America and Britain. And so the movie ended up exposing this issue that Frank Sinatra acted in and showing that not only were they enduring experimentations, but they also did experimentations on mind-altering drugs, shock therapy, as well as compartmentalizing and splitting the mind so that if an agent were to be sent out into the field and he was arrested and caught, that he can compartmentalize his secrets that he has without, even under duress, even under torture, without divulging state secrets. And so it was extremely important to promote the idea, even though it was almost untenable to do, to manifest into real life that one could actually survive torture without divulging state secrets. Or somebody who was trained as an assassin but lived as a normal person, but somebody came along and gave them a key word as their handler and triggered them into becoming this hypnotized assassin killer. And so we kind of see the impetus of the Jason Bourne type of character that Robert Ludlum talked about later on. And he based that on the exposés in the 1970s about these MK Ultra programs and super soldier mind-controlled assassin programs that ended up being utter failures, to be honest. But the point is that the MK Ultra program was only able to take place because of the National Security Act that was passed in 1947. In the effort to combat Soviet expansion, the Soviet Union, with just a few years before, were allied with the Western governments to fight Germany in World War II. Congress passed laws empowering the creation of an intelligence apparatus that ended up taking on a life unto its own and was split between many different agencies, and not least of which was the CIA. So the National Security Act was passed in 1947. The NSA was formed in 1952 later on. But the CIA was formed out of the OSS. and initially started in about 1947 and 1948, the same year that the National Security Act was passed. The lie is that it was formed to combat Soviet operations, when in reality, the CIA is a private army for the international bankers. This is why they employed the partnership with mafia organizations globally, and much of the large profit operations were white-collar crimes, ran by mafia and on behalf of the international bankers. Now, it is true that the impetus and policy for the intelligentsia came from think tanks and NGOs like the Tavistock Institute, like the Rand Corporation, and they even used private security firms like the Pinkertons. Others have spoken about this issue before, so that's nothing new. But just remember, though, that even the think tanks were funded by the international bankers directly. So policy came from high above. But when it came to big operations like Operation Mockingbird and Underworld and Gladio, black ops organizations weren't always used. Sometimes it took individuals and groups that were more street savvy. For instance, in a conversation I had years ago with someone from the world of the mafia, Jewish mafia to be clear, this individual explained to me about this history with my Uncle Jimmy and Meyer Lansky, who were partners in almost everything they did. So as a teenager, this guy knew Lansky and began working for them both at a young age, both Jimmy Alo and Meyer Lansky. So he knew them both intimately. So interestingly, when I inquired of him about the Jewish mafia, not just the Italian, but also the Jewish mafia's history with the intelligence organizations, he had a lot to say about it. One of the things is that he refuted the idea that just because he was Jewish, or we are Jewish, meaning his group, that we got away with things, that we had a free pass on certain things. He said, for instance, I love America, and I love this country, and for what it's done for my people. But let me explain a story about how much was done by Meyer Lansky for both America and the State of Israel in its early days, and then what they did to reward him. So he went on to explain about that after World War II, Jewish organizations wanted to immigrate to what was known then as Palestine and form the State of Israel. Now, they faced great resistance in their efforts to do so, and so once many of the European Jews began showing up in Palestine, a conflict began, which escalated into war. Many of the European nations in the post-war years still possessed a lot of the military equipment, and it was still laying around unused. But those countries refused or were unable to send as aid that weaponry to the conflict. So the federal government reached out to Meyer Lansky and others in the mafia and arranged for them to take weapons that were seized by the ATF from criminal organizations in America. These weapons were taken from criminal operations in America by the ATF, put into shipping containers, and they were trafficked to the ongoing conflict. Because of this arming of Jews in the fight for the establishment of the State of Israel, they won their right to exist. Now, that would not have happened if not for Meyer Lansky acting on behalf of many of his comrades in the Jewish mafia as well as Jimmy Alo and others acting on the behalf of their Italian counterparts. This arrangement had been copied in different parts of the world in an ongoing operation called Operation Gladio. This is one of those manifestations of its existence. Now, years later, Meyer Lansky was pursued by the federal government in America because of his illegal activities. So he decided to take his right of refuge, or aliyah, to the State of Israel to seek refuge. And the government there told him that if you want to come here, you have to deposit your money into our central bank. At the time, he had about what's equivalent to $230, $240 million in today's money. So once doing so, he was able to take refuge there, and he did. And it wasn't until a couple of weeks later where he was arrested by the authorities and brought into the embassy for questioning. And they ultimately told him that we didn't know you were part of the mafia. No mafia is allowed in Israel, no mafia. So they arrested him and deported him back to America, and they kept his money. Do you understand that? They kept his money. Now, when this individual explained the story to me, he had this tonality of great betrayal and disgust. And after everything Meyer Lansky not only did to serve the American government and its ongoing operations with allies and the integral role he played in helping the establishment of the State of Israel, they not only refused to give him refuge, but stole his entire life's fortune. So when he went on to explain that, just because somebody is a Jew like Meyer Lansky, don't think that they can also get away with anything, that's what he meant. They also can get screwed over even when they work towards the establishment of the State of Israel. This man took this issue very personally, very seriously. He loved America, loved the State of Israel, hated the governments because of their hypocrisy. So you see this repeated pattern of a double politic that I've spoken about before, where they claim that there's a certain equality of justice under the law, and people from that world especially know that's not the case. Now, how important do you think knowing a story like this is in understanding not only the stated purpose of the intelligence organizations, but the actual nature demonstrated about what they actually are about, who they actually are, what the nature is that they actually possess? I don't know about you, but when I learn of stories like this, and there's tons of other stories I've learned about, but this particular story hit home for me because it proves how corrupt the political structure is, to a point where it can't even protect the very people that are giving it life, that are feeding it, that are funding it. The very people funding and feeding the political structure itself are being betrayed while also claiming there is a protection of democracy and freedom, because it's all a lie. So, escape from Ravenscrag means that we should wake up to reality and escape from this mental prison enforced by the lie of freedom and democracy, so that you're not confused when you witness the true nature of the structure itself. This same political structure is the very entity that promotes critical theory, that promotes critical race theory, that opens the borders and lets the third world come in. But they didn't come in from nowhere. Many of these countries are being destroyed and bombed by our foreign policy wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, other countries. And these people are fleeing for their lives. Even if it's not a direct war, but say the war, the drug war, South America, Central America, Mexico, and it corrupts a government so bad that the only way for a family to survive is to go to a place where there's more stability. So these people are literally being driven out of their own homes into our countries. And that causes a culture clash. And it's not just a culture clash, but it's a worldview clash. A lot of these people, all they have ever known is American bombs bombing their village. They come into our European countries and the colonies like America, and they see it as you owe us. And so they want to come here, and there's a clash, right? Well, who caused this? The average person on the street didn't cause this, because every time you vote for something, the government, the structure itself, does the opposite of what you want. So it was the structure itself and those participating in controlling the structure itself. And it doesn't represent the American people. It sure as hell doesn't represent the people in the countries that are being bombed to death. It represents its own interests. And just like it used Meyer Lansky to establish the State of Israel and then burned him as an asset, they also are trying to demographically displace Western countries with people that they've thrown into destitution by destroying their countries. And when these people flee into our countries, again, that's where the clash begins. And they're not flying and importing these people into Japan or China or Saudi Arabia. They're bringing them into Western countries. Why would they do that? Remember, all policies come from a total worldview politic. How much more so do you think those individual policies come from a total worldview politic from this political structure? If it is known that this political structure embraces deconstructionism of Western Christian civilization, demographic displacement, which is genocide of Western countries, the physical destruction of Muslim Arab countries as well as African countries, making them flee into our countries, then you understand its nature. Don't you see that everybody involved in this scenario is nothing more than an expendable asset? They're not favoring one group for another. They're using all the groups against each other so that nobody challenges their hierarchy, their position. This is the mental prison. So, people have to understand that democracy is not a form of government, as promised. It is an attribute of a political system, but it is not a governmental and political system in and of itself. Socrates spoke about this clearly in Plato's Republic 2,400 years ago. The reason why he favored a republic is because a republic is founded on the implementation of perennial principles, not consensus theory of the ever-changing belief systems and opinions of the masses. If the culture and demography changes of, say, like California, where in the 1960s it was 96% white and somewhat Christian, and now is less than 35% white and Christian, do you think that correlates at all to a change in how things take place and what the political decisions and policies are that take place? That's huge. And don't think that the people that are causing this to change really care about the average people that live in California now, that have replaced the majority population of Americans from before. Now, anybody that's walked the streets of the cities of Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, or anywhere else knows they don't care. If they cared with the immense wealth that they have, they would make sure everybody is housed, everybody's taken care of. They're using you. They care about how others have been used against Western European civilization because that's the entire political character of critical theory. Critical theory is a system of thought based on an idea of dialectical materialism and determinism. It's atheistic in nature, but believes also there's a determinate will in the material of the universe moving towards a utopian outcome. And anything that gets in the way of this utopian outcome is an obstacle that must be overcome. The real question comes to mind then is, if all there is matter, how is it this matter has a will and a conscience? Why would this matter have a will towards destroying anything, let alone something or someone that has developed advanced Western civilization? Everything that is transported transported on technology created by Western civilization, feeding the world, even the poor. Planes, trains, automobiles, cargo ships, vaccines and medicine, although a corrupt industry, has actually helped a lot of people with things like antibiotics and penicillin. These things have changed the world for the better, even for the poverty-stricken. Everything that you see and use every single day comes from Western civilization. Computers, cell phones, TVs, engineered roads, where you drive your car on, the form of government itself and its legal systems, its protections, its contracts. As imperfect as it is still what gives the ability to live in a modern way to even the most poverty-stricken. Why would a determinate will of an inanimate material matter want that civilization gone? You can begin to see how ridiculous such a claim is. And it sounds like it's nothing more than a gang of gangsters that simply want to take what they haven't created, what they haven't made, and they just want to steal it and take it for themselves, just like a common thief. A cabal of thieves, as Socrates talked about. So this is the entire foundation of the modern political structure itself, while at the same time they claim we participate in equality and democracy. And as we've seen, many people are really waking up to this reality, over the past couple of years especially. Even very prominent business people, media personalities, Elon Musk not least of which, and others clearly state that racism is wrong, but racism against white people is just as bad. I mean, we didn't see this years ago. And they also claim that it sounds like revenge politics, and it's just going to lead to more conflict. It's going to lead to more revenge. And it's not the nature of equality and democracy. So they see the hypocrisy in the system itself. It leads to constant conflict. So again, about 30 years ago, I discovered the subjects of the MK Ultra programs and the vast application of their influence on the media and academia, on the medical establishment, on the entertainment, on the on all these types of industries through suggestive programming, predictive programming, moving towards changing society in all manners towards a determined outcome of deconstruction. And it's all driven while declaring that there is freedom and democracy. And that's the biggest lie that people are realizing now. And I'm really happy for that, because I felt like I was screaming at a rooftop where nobody was listening or hardly anybody was listening. And now people are seeing it with their own two eyes and their own reasoning. So that's really, really good. And ironically, I was trying to scream from the rooftops while in the corrupt media system itself in Hollywood. I tried to be a screenwriter. My first attempt at trying to do this was in 2001 when I discussed the assassination of Martin Luther King and a script I wrote called Codenames Earl. Imagine, though, that's the most liberal thing you could possibly do, is try to write as a screenwriter, try to write a script about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the truth on the matter. And you think it would have been totally embraced. And at the outset, it was. And I was at many of the studios and many of the production offices and so forth. But when they really got down to the nitty-gritty of what we were talking about, it scared them, because it was a critique of the political structure itself. And this lack of self-examination and correction is just undeniable. And it's more undeniable today than it ever has been. So again, I'm really happy to see that there's a self-examination going on in the public, in the masses, even of people participating in the structure, because they don't want to lose their free lunch. And you see it manifested. Even just yesterday, I saw somebody post something. The guy's name is Zuby on Twitter. He wrote something about the state of the destruction of the West and how it's tied to Christianity. And he says, I don't think I've ever said this publicly and directly, but I think the West is absolutely screwed if it loses Christianity. Explaining this in full would require an entire book, but I thought about it a lot over the years and reached this conclusion. It's like removing the foundations of a building, but pridefully expecting it to remain standing forever. All the while, enemies both sides and outside are trying to knock the building over. So he's saying exactly what myself and many others that I'm in association with have been talking about. The deconstruction of the West is best fought by reinforcing the foundations of our society with the very things that went into building it. And again, if politics is downstream from culture and culture is downstream from the virtues and ethics and morals and laws, then where do we get those from? And we got them undeniably, historically, from Christianity. And so I'm very hopeful and optimistic because of this general awareness that's going on. And this awareness that you can't just be aware of the enemy and then scream about that there's somebody doing it, but knowing what to do about it. And there's a lot of guys that want to go out there and fight the enemy. They want to protest on the street. They want to grab their guns. It's the second revolution, all this other stuff. But even if you can imagine transporting everybody that you don't like to Mars, and all of a sudden you had no enemies, what would you do to maintain society? Because if you're not maintaining society and how it was firmly established, in the next couple of generations, you're just going to have more people just like that we see today in the woke mind virus culture. So it's not just good enough to know the enemy or even remove the enemy. You have to concurrently also maintain the very thing that they're uprooting. And if they hate the things that they're uprooting so much, you should have a clue that you're in the right direction if you're trying to protect Western civilization from being totally destroyed, right? And you have to be honest enough. People are so dishonest when it comes to this issue. They always run to the corner and screech about how there's separation of church and state. Nobody's saying we want the church to run the government. We're saying that the principles of Christianity should be a shared common ethic amongst each other, even if you're not Christian. And that is the case. A pagan society didn't even have a set of laws, and even when some pagan societies did, they were not based off of the fairness that we see today. These issues of fairness that we see today come from Christianity, come from secular implementation of it, yes, but still nonetheless, you're not talking about something from ancient Egypt where they enforced slavery and enforced people as property, even your wives as property and all those things. So This is a different issue. So our culture didn't come from China. Our culture didn't come from India. It didn't come from paganism. It came from Europe, and Europe is Christian for about 1,500 years. And the lack of honesty about this subject is really shocking. So first step in recognizing there's a problem is admitting that there's a problem. And the problem is not just outwardly, it's inwardly. The individual can only participate with the fixing of society outside of himself if he's first fixing himself first. Get right. Right mind leads to right action. So going into 2024, I'm hoping more people wake up to this issue, and in doing so, that Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox can stop fighting amongst each other and stop attacking each other, and use a modicum of that energy used to attack each other and direct it towards the enemy. And if you have enough of an overlap and you have enough of a cooperation together, even with the atheists that share the common goal, even with the agnostics, even with the non-Abrahamic religions, then and non-Christian religions, that you can have a common goal to work towards, right? And otherwise, we're just going to go extinct. And if we go extinct, then none of this matters. So keep an eye on that. Keep positive. Do positive things. Think positive things, while at the same time that you're being realistic about the enemy and our shortcomings and our failures. So again, Happy New Year 2024. Have a good evening, and remember why we fight.